The Stranger on the Shore. In late November, a cold mist clung to the rugged cliffs of Morro Strait, an isolated stretch of coastline far removed from the comforts of the city. Andrew and Sarah had ventured into this wilderness seeking solitude and waves. Both avid surfers, they'd made a habit of chasing the perfect break, no matter how remote the location. This time, the surf forecast led them to the Strait, a place they'd visited only twice before. Rugged beauty was its trademark: jagged cliffs, dense forests, and an endless expanse of ocean stretching out into the gray horizon. Few dared to venture this far. The drive alone, a winding highway carved into the cliffs, was enough to deter most travelers. Here, cell service vanished, and tiny, weathered fishing villages served as the only markers of civilization. By the time they arrived, the sky had begun to darken, the sun's glow fading into the swirling clouds. The beach was empty except for a single Volkswagen camper van parked near the tree line. A faint plume of smoke rose from the van's campsite, where a young couple sat huddled by a fire. "It's perfect," Andrew said as he turned off the engine. Sarah nodded, though something about the setting unsettled her. The silence was too deep, too complete, as if the landscape itself held its breath. The man from nowhere. The hours passed quietly. They cooked dinner on a small propane stove, the faint hiss of the flame the only sound breaking the stillness. Sarah took a short walk along the beach while Andrew studied the waves by flashlight. As the last light of day faded, a sharp whistle pierced the quiet. Sarah turned toward the sound, scanning the edge of the forest where a man had appeared, silhouetted against the twilight. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a small backpack slung over one shoulder. "What's he doing here?" Sarah murmured as she walked back to the car. Andrew followed her gaze. "There's nothing out here. No trails, no houses. Weird." The man made his way down the incline, his footsteps crunching over gravel. He seemed calm, purposeful, as if he belonged here. But there was no reason for anyone to appear from the forest. The nearest road was miles away, and he carried none of the gear a hiker or camper might need. As they watched, he approached the couple by the camper van. There was a brief exchange of words, and then the man settled down by their fire. Andrew shrugged. "Probably just some drifter. If they're okay with him, it's not our problem." But Sarah couldn't shake the unease that crept up her spine. The first sign. By 7 p.m., the couple decided to call it a night. They climbed into the back of their SUV, bundled in sleeping bags, and settled in. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the shore lulled them into a restless sleep. Around 8 o'clock, Sarah stirred. She cracked the car door to let in some fresh air, only to notice the faint smell of wood smoke lingering in the night. Peering outside, she realized the camper van was gone. "Andrew," she whispered, nudging him awake. He groaned. "What is it?" "The van. It's gone." "So, maybe they left." Sarah frowned, the unease returning with greater force. Something about the van's sudden departure didn't sit right, but Andrew was already asleep again, and Sarah told herself she was overthinking things. The next time she woke, it was to the sound of something faint, barely audible over the muffled crash of the waves. Tap, tap, tap. She sat up sharply, her sudden movement startling Andrew awake. "What's wrong?" he asked groggily. Sarah shushed him, her ears straining in the darkness. Tap, tap. It came again, unmistakably clear. Someone, or something, was tapping on the windows. The shadows in the dark. Andrew stiffened, his sleepiness evaporating. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the flashlight from the dashboard. "No way," Sarah hissed. She reached for the can of pepper spray in the cup holder, her hand trembling. Together, they stepped out of the SUV. The world beyond was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of waves. Andrew swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, then toward the beach. Nothing moved, but the darkness seemed alive, pressing against the edges of the light. "See anything?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Andrew shook his head. "Let's check near the exit. Maybe there's someone messing with us." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him, keeping her flashlight trained on the ground. They hadn't gone far when Andrew froze. "There," he whispered, pointing ahead. Parked just off the exit road was an old sedan, its engine idling. The headlights were off, but faint wisps of exhaust curled into the cold night air. "Someone's in there," Andrew muttered, his face pale. "What do we do?" Sarah's voice was barely more than a squeak. Andrew hesitated for only a moment before whispering, "We get in the car. Now." The chase. They hurried back to their SUV, the sense of urgency overwhelming. Tossing their gear haphazardly into the back, Andrew jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Don't take the exit road," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I know," Andrew replied, spinning the wheel to head back toward the highway entrance. As they passed the exit road, the sedan's headlights flared to life. A deep rumble filled the air as the car roared to life, peeling onto the gravel behind them. "They're following us!" Sarah screamed, clutching the dashboard. The highway was a narrow strip of asphalt bordered by cliffs on one side and ocean on the other. There were no turnouts, no places to hide. Andrew floored the accelerator, the SUV's engine straining as they raced along the dark road. In the rearview mirror, the sedan kept pace, its headlights glaring like twin suns. "Where can we go?" Sarah cried. "There, up ahead," Andrew shouted, spotting a small turnout barely visible in the dark. He jerked the wheel, skidding onto the dirt shoulder as the sedan barreled past them. They sat in tense silence, the SUV's engine idling. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, slowly, the sedan's taillights disappeared into the night. The whispering woods, deep in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by dense forests and winding trails, lies a stretch of wilderness known only to locals. It's a place of stunning natural beauty, but also one of whispered warnings. A place where the trails grow cold and the shadows seem to stretch too long. Sam, a freelance writer, had lived in the area for years. He loved the solitude of the forest, taking his dog on long hikes and camping trips whenever his workload allowed. But the isolation came with its risks. Sam had heard the stories: hikers who disappeared, strange figures spotted near abandoned trails, and vehicles found broken down with no sign of their owners. Still, the forest was Sam's refuge. He told himself the rumors were just that: campfire tales meant to scare tourists. But one weekend, while exploring deeper into the woods with two friends, he learned just how real those stories could be. The abandoned road. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Sam and his friends, Jacob and Isaac, decided to head into the forest for a weekend of paintball and camping. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp, and spend the next morning pelting each other with paintballs. They drove Sam's old F-150 deep into the forest, passing the usual trailheads and marked camping areas. By the time they reached their destination, a secluded clearing by a creek, it was late afternoon. The road leading there was overgrown, blocked by a rusted metal barrier that someone had pushed aside long ago. "This looks sketchy," Isaac said, eyeing the barrier. Sam shrugged. "It's perfect. No one will bother us out here." The clearing was surrounded by towering pines, their thick canopy blocking out most of the light. A plywood table nailed to a tree stood near the creek, its surface covered in moss and littered with empty cans and cigarette butts. Blue tarps hung from the branches like forgotten banners. "Looks like someone's used this spot before," Jacob muttered, kicking an empty beer bottle into the weeds. "We'll clean it up," Sam said, already unloading their gear. The glow on the hill. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The group huddled around their fire, eating chili from tin bowls and trading stories. The forest around them grew darker, the silhouettes of trees merging into an impenetrable black wall. It was then that they noticed the light. At first it was faint, a soft glow filtering through the trees from the other side of a nearby hill. It didn't flicker like a campfire or move like a flashlight. "What is that?" Jacob asked, setting down his bowl. "Probably moonlight," Sam offered, though the angle seemed wrong. Curiosity got the better of them. Leaving Isaac behind to tend the fire, Sam and Jacob grabbed their flashlights and headed toward the hill. The forest grew unnervingly silent as they approached. The usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves vanished, replaced by heavy stillness. The air felt colder here, and the trees bore strange scars, rings of bark stripped away in perfect circles, as if by some meticulous hand. "Ghost beavers," Jacob joked, though his voice wavered. They crested the hill and froze. At the base of the slope was the source of the glow, a faintly illuminated clearing. But as they stepped closer, Jacob tripped over something and cursed loudly. The light vanished instantly. "Let's go back," Sam whispered, his voice tight. Jacob didn't argue. They turned off their flashlights, relying on the faint moonlight to guide them back to camp. The hooded figure. As they neared the fire, the faint glow of the flames came into view. Isaac was there, pacing back and forth, a hooded coat pulled tightly around him. He carried his paintball gun, the barrel swinging from side to side as if searching for something. "What's he doing?" Jacob muttered. "Maybe he heard something," Sam replied, though unease clawed at his mind. They called out to him, but Isaac didn't respond. Instead, he walked up the dirt path leading away from camp, disappearing into the shadows. Confused, they hurried back to the campsite only to find Isaac stumbling out of the tent. His face was pale and he rubbed his eyes groggily. "What's wrong with you guys?" he asked, yawning. Sam stared at him. "What were you doing with the paintball gun?" Isaac frowned. "What are you talking about? The guns are in the truck." Jacob ran to check. The gear was still locked in the truck bed, the keys hidden in their magnetic fob exactly where they'd left them. It hit them all at once. Someone else had been at their campsite. The barrier returns panic set in as the group hurriedly packed their things. No one spoke, their shared fear hanging heavy in the air. They left the tent behind, along with their sleeping bags, stuffing everything else into the truck as fast as they could. Sam started the engine and drove toward the main road, the truck's headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, but when they reached the dirt mound where they'd first entered the clearing, they stopped cold. The rusted metal barrier was back in place. It balanced precariously on top of the mound, as if someone had carefully repositioned it. "Don't stop," Isaac said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam inched the truck forward, tapping the barrier with the front guard until it tipped over. The tires crunched over the metal as they passed, and the group let out a collective breath. But relief was short-lived. "Don't stop," Jacob hissed, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Sam glanced back and felt his stomach drop. A vehicle was following them, its headlights off, creeping through the darkness like a predator. The endless chase. The truck roared down the dirt road, the suspension groaning as it navigated sharp turns and uneven terrain. Behind them, the shadowy vehicle kept pace, its presence an ominous weight pressing on their nerves. "Faster," Isaac urged, gripping the seat. "I'm going as fast as I can," Sam snapped, the tension in his voice betraying his fear. For 45 agonizing minutes, the vehicle trailed them, never falling too far behind. Each time the road straightened, they caught a fleeting glimpse of it, a dark silhouette in the faint glow of the moon. Finally, they reached the main highway. Sam didn't slow down, taking the first turnoff he saw to throw off their pursuer. The shadowy vehicle didn't follow. They drove in silence the rest of the way home, their minds racing with unspoken questions. Who had been at their campsite? What had been hiding behind the glow on the hill? And why did it feel as though the forest itself had been watching them? The tarp in the rain. It was late November in the Virginia mountains, cold and wet from days of relentless rain. 4 friends, Ethan, Kara, Ben, and Rachel, had set out on what they'd promised would be a fun camping trip. Ethan and Ben were seasoned outdoorsmen who loved the challenge of roughing it, while Kara and Rachel, their girlfriends, were less enthusiastic. "This is going to be great," Ethan had assured them as they packed the car that morning. By the time they reached their secret camping spot, a remote overlook deep in the mountains, it was nearly pitch black. Freezing rain pelted them as they unloaded their gear, the wind howling through the trees. Kara and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances. The rain wasn't just unpleasant, it was bone-chilling, and the steep, unmarked trail leading down to their campsite looked treacherous in the dim glow of their headlamps. "I don't know about this," Kara said, shivering as she adjusted her raincoat. "We'll get a fire going in no time," Ethan promised. "It'll be worth it." But by the end of the night, they'd regret every step they'd taken into those woods. The strange tarp. The descent to their hidden campsite was brutal. The trail was slick with mud, and the mist from their headlamps reflected back at them, making it hard to see. To avoid slipping, they developed a system. Kara and Rachel carried gear partway down, while Ethan and Ben followed with the rest. The group was almost to the bottom when Kara froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing into the darkness. Ethan followed her gaze. There, about 20 feet ahead, was a crumpled blue tarp lying at the edge of the trail. Beside it was a small handheld shopping basket filled with empty snack wrappers. "Probably just trash," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. But Kara's voice trembled. What if someone's under it?" "That's ridiculous," Ethan said. But something about the tarp unsettled him. There were no roads, no trails, and no reason for anyone to be out here, especially in this weather. As he stepped closer, Ethan's flashlight caught the edge of the tarp. For a moment, he thought he saw it shift, just slightly, as if stirred by the wind. But there was no wind. "See?" he said, crouching down. "It's just—" The tarp moved again. This time, it was unmistakable. The moan "Ethan" froze, his breath catching in his throat. Kara took a step back, her voice barely a whisper. "There's someone under there." "Hey," Ethan said, his voice trembling as he forced himself to speak. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The only response was a low, guttural moan. Ethan stood, his legs stiff with fear. "We should go." Before he could say another word, Kara was scrambling back up the incline, slipping and sliding on the muddy rocks. Ethan turned off his headlamp, plunging the woods into near-total darkness. He stood motionless, straining to hear over the pounding rain. Rocks shifted. Whoever, or whatever, was under the tarp was moving. "Hello?" Ethan called out again, his voice breaking. "Do you need help?" Silence. The tarp rustled and Ethan bolted. Something in the dark. By the time Ethan reached the top of the trail, Kara was already at the overlook, wide-eyed and trembling. Rachel and Ben were standing under a tarp they'd set up for shelter, both looking confused. "What happened?" Ben asked. "There's someone down there," Kara said, her voice shaking. "Someone?" Rachel asked, glancing toward the trail. Ethan nodded. "Under a tarp. They moaned. I don't know who they are, but they're moving around." Ben frowned. "Maybe they're hurt. We should check it out." "No," Ethan snapped. "Something's not right. They didn't answer when I called out. It was—" He trailed off, unable to find the words to explain the wrongness of what he'd felt. The rain picked up, drumming against the tarp overhead. Rachel looked at the trail, her expression uneasy. "You really think someone's out there?" Kara nodded emphatically. "We need to leave." The locksmith's warning. As they debated what to do, Ben realized another problem. The car keys were locked inside the vehicle. "What?" Ethan hissed. Ben winced. "I must have dropped them in the trunk while we were unpacking. My bad." "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan said, running a hand through his wet hair. For the next 2 hours, they huddled under the tarp while Ben desperately tried to get a signal on his phone. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press closer with every passing minute. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a branch sent his heart racing. He kept his eyes locked on the trail, half expecting to see the figure from under the tarp appear at any moment. Finally, Ben managed to call a locksmith, who arrived just before midnight. The man was gruff and clearly unhappy about being called out in such awful weather. As they explained what had happened, his expression darkened. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low. "There's been bad stuff in these woods." "What kind of bad stuff?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The locksmith shook his head. "Hikers gone missing. Bodies found, some not. And some people just hiding out here. People you don't want to meet." The tarp moves again. They didn't bother setting up camp. Instead, they threw their gear into the car and left as fast as the slick, winding roads would allow. As they drove, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the tarp. Who, or what, had been underneath it? Why hadn't they answered? And why had the locksmith been so cryptic? Hours later, back home, Ethan lay awake, replaying the night in his mind. Somewhere deep in the woods, the rain had finally stopped. Beneath the trees, hidden from view, the blue tarp shifted again, and something beneath it began to crawl. The phantom of the campfire. Late in the fall, when the Virginia mountains were cloaked in mist and the trees stood bare, Sarah and Jake joined their friends Mia and Carter for a camping trip. The four of them were seasoned adventurers, always chasing the thrill of the unknown. Carter had found a perfect campsite deep in a remote part of the national forest. It wasn't marked on any map, but he swore it offered the best views and total privacy. The others agreed without hesitation, trusting Carter's knack for finding hidden gems. But by the time they arrived, the sun had set, and the forest was swallowed in darkness. Their headlights barely penetrated the thick fog that clung to the narrow dirt road. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "Sure, this is the right spot?" Jake asked, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. Carter grinned. "Positive. Just wait till morning. You'll see." Sarah didn't share his enthusiasm. Something about the woods felt wrong. The silent stranger. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally came to a stop in a small clearing. The air was cold and damp, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves thick in their nostrils. As they unloaded their gear, the silence of the forest pressed in on them. There were no crickets, no distant calls of owls, just an eerie stillness that seemed to absorb every sound they made. "Spooky," Mia said with a nervous laugh, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Relax," Carter replied. "It's just nature." By the time they'd set up camp and started a fire, the tension had eased slightly. They laughed and shared stories, their voices echoing into the still night. But as the flames crackled and the hours wore on, Sarah noticed something strange. Beyond the firelight, just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood watching them. At first, she thought it was her imagination. The figure didn't move, and the shadows danced oddly in the flickering light. "Guys," she said, her voice low. "Do you see that?" Jake turned, following her gaze. His face paled. Standing among the trees was a man in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He made no sound, no movement. "Hello," Carter called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The figure didn't respond. Vanishing into the dark. They watched the figure for what felt like an eternity, the fire crackling between them and the silent intruder. Then, without warning, the man turned and disappeared into the woods. "Did anyone else feel that?" Mia whispered, clutching her arms. "Feel what?" Jake asked, his voice tight. "Cold. When he left, it felt colder." Carter shook his head. "It's just some weirdo. He's gone now. Let's not freak out." But Sarah couldn't let it go. Why didn't he say anything? Why was he just standing there? "Maybe he was lost," Carter said, though he didn't sound convinced. They tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. The fire seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. Eventually, they retreated to their tents, though none of them felt like sleeping. The whispering wind. Sarah woke sometime after midnight, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she wasn't sure what had startled her, but then she heard it, a faint whispering outside the tent. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it didn't sound like the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Jake," she whispered, nudging him awake. "What is it?" he murmured groggily. "Listen." He froze, his breath hitching as the whispers continued. Slowly, he unzipped the tent and peeked outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers and the forest was still and empty. "Probably the wind," Jake muttered, though his tone betrayed his unease. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching them. The circle of fire. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the unease lingered. As the group packed up their gear, Mia noticed something strange in the dirt around the campsite, a series of footprints circling the extinguished fire. "They're too big to be ours," she said, her voice trembling. Jake crouched down, inspecting the tracks. They were deep, the edges blurred as if someone, or something, had moved deliberately around the fire throughout the night. Sarah's stomach dropped. He was here. "No," Carter said firmly. "That's impossible. We would have heard him." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The memory of the silent figure standing at the edge of the clearing was burned into her mind. The final warning. As they drove back toward civilization, the tension in the car was palpable. They didn't speak much, each lost in their own thoughts. Halfway down the mountain, they passed a small dirt turnout. Parked there was a car, old, rusted, and covered in grime. In the driver's seat sat the man from the night before, his face pale and expressionless. "He's back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Carter sped up, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. "We're not stopping." The rest of the drive was a blur. When they finally reached town, they didn't say goodbye. They simply unloaded their gear and went their separate ways, each silently agreeing never to speak of the trip again. But that night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard it again. Faint whispers drifting through the open window, carried on the wind. And she knew the man wasn't done with her yet. The Red Lantern of Montreuil. On the outskirts of Paris lies the district of Montreuil, a neighborhood caught between the city's modern bustle and its ancient past. It's a place of winding alleys, crumbling stone walls, and whispers of ghostly legends. When Jake and Lauren, two American tourists, arrived in Montreuil for a weekend stay, they were eager to explore its less-traveled corners. Their Airbnb host, a reserved man named Etienne, welcomed them with a cryptic smile. "You're staying in a very historic part of Paris," he said as he handed over the keys to a small ivy-covered flat. "But be careful. Some places hold on to the past, more than others." Jake laughed nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" Etienne only shrugged. "If you hear the lantern's call, don't follow it." The couple exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if Etienne was joking or genuinely trying to warn them. The lantern's glow. That evening, Jake and Lauren decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The narrow streets were lined with old stone buildings, their facades lit by flickering street lamps. The air was cool, and a faint mist clung to the ground, muffling their footsteps. As they wandered farther from the main thoroughfares, the streets grew quieter and darker. The modern lights gave way to older lanterns, their glow dim and uneven. "Spooky, but kind of romantic," Lauren said, looping her arm through Jake's. Jake nodded, though he felt a strange unease creeping over him. As they turned a corner, a red light appeared in the distance, swaying gently as if carried by an invisible hand. "What's that?" Lauren asked, stopping in her tracks. Jake squinted. The light was unnaturally vivid, its crimson hue stark against the pale mist. It hovered at the end of the alley just beyond the reach of the nearest street lamp. "Probably just someone with a lantern," Jake said, though his voice wavered. Lauren tilted her head. "Who uses lanterns anymore?" The light began to move. gliding slowly down the alley as if beckoning them to follow. The Alley of Echoes. "Should we check it out?" Lauren asked, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Jake hesitated. Etienne's warning echoed in his mind, but he shook it off. It was just a local legend, something to add flavor to their stay. "Sure," he said, forcing a grin. "Why not?" They followed the red light as it floated deeper into the labyrinth of alleys. The further they went, the quieter the world became. The distant hum of traffic faded, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from unseen gutters. The light turned a corner, and they hurried to keep up, but when they rounded the bend, it was gone. Instead, they found themselves standing in a narrow courtyard surrounded by tall, dark buildings. The air was colder here, and the mist was thicker, swirling around their ankles like grasping fingers. "I don't like this," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his unease growing into something closer to fear. "Let's head back." As they turned to leave, the red light reappeared, hovering at the courtyard's edge. The whispered name. This time, the light was accompanied by a sound, a faint rhythmic whisper. The words were indecipherable, but they seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Jake," Lauren said, clutching his arm. The whispers grew louder, the cadence rising and falling like a chant. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice shaking. The light flickered, then began to move toward them. "Run," Lauren whispered, pulling Jake's arm. They turned and bolted down the nearest alley, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic. Jake glanced over his shoulder and saw the red light pursuing them, its glow spilling over the cobblestones like blood. "This way," Lauren shouted, yanking him toward a side street. The door that wasn't there. The alley opened into another courtyard, this one dominated by a tall wooden door set into the stone wall. It was old and weathered, the wood splintered and blackened with age. "That wasn't there before," Jake said, panting. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Lauren pushed against the door, and to their surprise, it swung open. Without hesitation, they stepped inside and slammed it shut behind them. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then Jake noticed their surroundings. They were standing in a large, circular room lit by dozens of red lanterns. The walls were lined with portraits, faces of men and women frozen in expressions of terror. "What is this place?" Lauren whispered, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a single lantern hanging in the center of the room. Unlike the others, its glow pulsed faintly, like a dying heartbeat. As they stared, the whispers returned, softer now, but more insistent. "Leave," they seemed to say, "or join us." The figures at the window. Paris in late autumn has a certain magic, a chill in the air, the warm glow of streetlights reflecting off cobblestones, and an undeniable sense of history pressing against every corner. For Rachel and David, two Americans on their honeymoon, it was the perfect destination. They had splurged on a quaint rental apartment in the heart of Montmartre, nestled among narrow streets and staircases that wound up the hill to the Sacré-Cœur. The building was old, its stone walls cracked with age, but the charm outweighed the creaks and drafts. Their first night was spent wandering the neighborhood, indulging in wine and pastries from a nearby cafe. By the time they returned to the apartment, it was late, and the streets were eerily quiet. "This place feels like a dream," Rachel said, kicking off her shoes as they stepped inside. David smiled, pulling her into a hug. "Let's make it a good one." But that night, the dream turned into a nightmare. The first knock, sometime after midnight, Rachel woke to a soft knock at the window. She sat up, disoriented. The bedroom was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. "David," she whispered, nudging him awake. He groaned. "What? Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "Knock, knock, knock." Rachel stiffened. The sound was faint but deliberate, coming from the large window on the far side of the room. "Someone's at the window," she said, her voice trembling. David sat up, rubbing his eyes. "We're on the second floor. No one can reach the window." Knock, knock. This time, the sound was louder, more insistent. David swung his legs out of bed, grabbing his phone for light. He walked cautiously toward the window, his shadow stretching across the room. Rachel held her breath as he pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there. The shadow on the stairs. "See? Nothing," David said, though his voice wavered. Rachel nodded, though unease prickled at the back of her neck. "It sounded so close," she murmured. "It's probably the wind," David replied, climbing back into bed. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next morning, they woke to find faint smudges on the window, a streaky pattern, almost like handprints trailing down the glass. "That's weird," David said, running a finger over the marks. "Looks like condensation." Rachel wasn't convinced. The shapes were too distinct, the smudges too deliberate. But she pushed the thought aside, not wanting to ruin their trip. That evening, after a long day exploring Paris, they returned to the apartment and found the air inside colder than it should have been. "I'll check the windows," David said, wandering into the bedroom. Rachel hung her coat by the door, her gaze lingering on the staircase outside their apartment. A shadow flickered there, just for a moment, before vanishing into the darkness. "David," she called out, her voice tight. "What?" he replied, poking his head out of the bedroom. "Did you see someone on the stairs?" He frowned. "Number. Why?" Rachel shook her head. "No reason." But the unease from the night before crept back, stronger this time. The whisper behind the door. That night the knocking returned. Rachel woke with a start, her chest tight with fear. The sound wasn't coming from the window this time, it was coming from the front door. Knock, knock. David stirred beside her. "What is it?" "Someone's at the door," Rachel whispered. He groaned, throwing off the covers. "It's probably a neighbor or something." As he left the bedroom, Rachel followed close behind, clutching her phone like a lifeline. When David reached the door, he hesitated. The knocking had stopped, but now there was something else. A faint whispering, too soft to make out, coming from the other side. "Who's there?" David called, his voice steady but low. The whispering stopped. David leaned closer, his hand on the doorknob. "Don't," Rachel said sharply. But before he could respond, a single loud knock reverberated through the apartment, shaking the door in its frame. David stumbled back, his face pale. The figures appear. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the bedroom, the door locked and every light turned on. The apartment remained silent, but neither of them could sleep. When morning came, they ventured into the living room, only to find the front door ajar. "That's not possible," David muttered. "I locked it." Rachel didn't respond. Her attention was fixed on the window, where the smudges from the night before had reappeared, only now they were more distinct. Handprints, dozens of them, overlapping, all pressed against the glass as if an unseen crowd had gathered to watch them. "Pack your things," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving." David didn't argue. The final warning. As they carried their luggage down the narrow staircase, Rachel glanced back at the apartment one last time. In the second-floor window, she saw them. 3 dark figures, their faces obscured, standing perfectly still and watching her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Rachel," David called from the street below. When she turned back to the window, the figures were gone. They left Montmartre that morning and never returned. But even now, Rachel can't shake the feeling that the figures at the window are still watching, waiting for the next unwitting guest to arrive. The Catacombs Guardian. Deep beneath the streets of Paris lies a hidden world, a labyrinth of tunnels and crypts stretching for miles, where the remains of over 6 million people rest in silent stacks of bone. The Catacombs of Paris are a popular tourist attraction, but only a small portion is open to the public. Beyond the gated paths, the tunnels twist and turn in endless darkness, shrouded in mystery and tales of those who enter and never return. For Emily and Mark, two friends traveling through Europe, the catacombs were the ultimate adventure. They'd read about the restricted sections online, where thrill-seekers and urban explorers ventured illegally to uncover hidden chambers and forgotten relics. "This is going to be incredible," Mark said, adjusting the strap of his backpack. Emily hesitated as they stood outside the official catacombs entrance. The night air was cold, and the faint glow of the streetlights did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that lingered in the area. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Absolutely," Mark replied. "We've got the map, and I know the entrance. Just stick close to me." Reluctantly, Emily followed as Mark led her down a narrow side street, away from the tourists and into the shadows of the city. The hidden entrance. The entrance Mark had found wasn't easy to access. It was a small, rusted metal gate tucked behind an overgrown lot near an abandoned industrial building. The ground was damp, the air thick with the scent of moss and decay. Mark pushed open the gate, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. "This is it," he said, grinning. Emily peered down the steps, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "I don't know, Mark. This feels wrong." "It's fine," he insisted. "People do this all the time. We'll be in and out in a couple of hours." Emily swallowed her fear and followed him down the stairs. The air grew colder as they descended, and the sound of the city above faded into silence. The walls were damp and covered in graffiti, some of it fresh, some faded with age. "See?" Mark said, his voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. "It's not so bad." Emily nodded, though her unease only deepened. The bones begin. After several minutes of walking, the graffiti disappeared, replaced by something far more unsettling. The walls were lined with bones, thousands of them stacked neatly in intricate patterns. Skulls stared out from the piles, their hollow eyes seeming to follow the pair as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. "This is incredible," Mark whispered, his flashlight sweeping over the macabre display. Emily didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They turned a corner, and Mark stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Emily asked, peering over his shoulder. Ahead of them, the tunnel split into three paths. The map Mark had printed showed only one. "Which way?" Emily pressed, her voice tight. Mark hesitated, glancing between the dark openings. Let's try the middle one." As they stepped into the passage, Emily noticed something strange. Markings on the walls, faint symbols carved into the stone. "Did you see these?" she asked, running her fingers over one of the carvings. Mark shook his head. "Probably just old graffiti." But Emily wasn't so sure. The Guardian appears. The air grew heavier the further they went. Their flashlights began to flicker, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels. Then came the whispering. At first, Emily thought it was just the sound of their footsteps echoing strangely, but as they stopped to check their map, the whispers continued. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He frowned, tilting his head. "Hear what?" The whispering grew louder, a low, rasping sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Okay, let's go back," Emily said, panic rising in her chest. But when they turned around, the path behind them was gone. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, shining his flashlight wildly. The tunnel had changed, the walls now smooth and unmarked, the bones replaced by solid stone. "That's not possible," Emily said, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, joined by the faint sound of footsteps. Mark spun around, his flashlight catching a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting across the edge of the light. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. The Keeper of the Dead. From the darkness emerged a figure, its form shrouded in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its skeletal hands clutched a staff made of bone. Mark stumbled back, pulling Emily behind him. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed at them. The whispering surged, a cacophony of voices that seemed to scream and wail all at once. Emily covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing her hand. They bolted down the tunnel, the light from their flashlights bouncing wildly. The whispers followed, relentless and deafening. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to stretch through the tunnels, filling every shadow with a sense of dread. The endless labyrinth. No matter how far they ran, the tunnels never seemed to end. The air grew colder and the walls seemed to close in around them. "We're going in circles," Emily cried, her voice echoing in the oppressive silence. Mark stopped, panting and trembling. "I don't understand. The map doesn't matter," Emily snapped, her fear boiling over. "We need to get out of here." Ahead of them, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then, from the darkness came a voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't be here." The Chapel of Shadows? Tucked away in a forgotten corner of Paris's Latin Quarter, hidden behind a crumbling wall overgrown with ivy, stood a small chapel long abandoned by time. Locals rarely spoke of it, and tourists unaware of its existence walked by without a second glance. But for Mia and Chris, two American art students studying abroad, the chapel was an irresistible mystery. They had heard rumors about it during a late-night gathering at a cafe, a whispered tale from a local historian. "They call it the Chapel of Shadows," the man had said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Its murals are said to move in the dark." Chris had laughed it off as a tourist trap, but Mia's curiosity burned. By the next evening, she had convinced him to go. "Come on, it'll be fun," Mia had said, dragging him through the narrow streets. Chris had reluctantly agreed, but as they approached the chapel, its decayed facade emerging from the gloom, he couldn't help but feel a knot of unease tightening in his chest. The Forgotten Altar. The chapel's entrance was a heavy wooden door, its surface warped and splintered from years of neglect. A rusted chain hung loosely from the handle, as if someone had once tried to lock it but had long since abandoned the effort. "This place looks condemned," Chris muttered, eyeing the crumbling stonework. "Exactly," Mia said with a grin. "That means no one will bother us." She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of their flashlights, and the floor was littered with broken tiles and fragments of wood. The chapel's interior was sparse, its once grand architecture reduced to a skeleton of cracked stone and rotting beams. But at the far end of the room, beneath a shattered stained glass window, stood the altar. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The stone was black as obsidian, and carved into its surface were hundreds of intricate patterns, circles within circles, interlocking triangles, and symbols neither of them recognized. "Creepy," Chris said, running a hand over the carvings. Mia was already snapping photos, her excitement growing. "This is incredible. Look at the detail." The murals of the dead. The walls of the chapel were adorned with faded murals, their colors muted by time. At first glance, they appeared to depict scenes from the Bible, but as Mia examined them more closely, she realized something was off. In one mural, a crowd of people knelt before a figure in a hooded robe, their faces contorted in fear rather than devotion. In another, a dark shadow loomed over a group of figures, its skeletal hands reaching for them as they fled. "Are these supposed to be saints?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. Chris frowned, shining his flashlight over the murals. "I don't think so. Look at their faces. They're terrified." As the beam of his flashlight swept across the wall, something strange happened. For a moment, it seemed as though one of the painted figures moved, A slight shift, as if they had turned to look at him. Chris froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Mia asked, turning to him. "The painting. It moved." Mia laughed nervously. "It's probably just your imagination. Let's keep looking." The voice in the shadows. As they explored deeper into the chapel, the air grew colder and the silence became oppressive. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the walls were listening. Then came the voice. At first it was faint, a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "Mia," it said, barely audible. She stopped in her tracks, her flashlight shaking. "Did you hear that?" Chris nodded, his face pale. "It said your name." "Mia," the voice repeated, louder this time. It was low and guttural, as if it came from deep within the stone walls. "Who's there?" Chris shouted, his voice trembling. The only response was a faint chuckle echoing through the empty chapel. The shifting figures. Mia turned her flashlight back to the murals, her heart pounding. This time, there was no mistaking it. The painted figures had moved. The crowd that had knelt before the hooded figure was now staring directly at them, their painted eyes wide with terror. "Chris," she whispered, backing away. He turned and saw it too. The murals were changing before their eyes, the painted figures shifting subtly but unmistakably. The hooded figure on the wall now pointed directly at them, its skeletal hand extended in a silent command. "We need to leave," Chris said, grabbing Mia's arm. As they turned toward the exit, the wooden door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The keeper of the chapel. The laughter returned, louder now, reverberating through the chapel like a wave. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift and stretch, forming shapes that writhed and twisted unnaturally. From the darkness behind the altar emerged a figure cloaked in black. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure raised a hand, and the murals on the walls began to glow faintly, their painted figures writhing in agony. "Leave," the figure intoned, its voice a low growl. "Or join them." Mia and Chris didn't hesitate. They bolted toward the door, throwing their weight against it until it burst open. The curse follows. They ran through the dark streets of Montmartre, the cold night air stinging their lungs. When they finally reached their apartment, they locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, their bodies trembling with fear. "We're never going back there," Chris said, his voice shaking. Mia nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The photos she had taken, the evidence of what they'd seen, were still on her camera. She retrieved it from her bag, her hands trembling as she flipped through the images. Her heart stopped. In every photo of the murals, the painted figures were staring directly at the camera. And in the final image, the hooded figure stood in the center of the frame, its skeletal hand raised as if reaching for her. The silent train to nowhere. Paris is a city of lights and noise, cars honking, chatter spilling out from cafes, and the ever-present hum of the metro beneath the streets. But deep in the labyrinth of tunnels that make up the metro system, there are whispers of a train that doesn't belong. Locals call it le train silencieux, the silent train. Tourists rarely hear the legend, but for Ella and Ryan, two friends visiting Paris for the first time, it was the kind of mystery they couldn't resist. "I found it online," Ella had said, scrolling through an old blog. "There's this metro train that only shows up late at night. People say it takes you somewhere. You're not supposed to go." Ryan laughed. "Some urban legend? Sounds like a haunted house on wheels." "Come on," Ella pressed. "Let's check it out. Worst case, it's just a spooky story, and we waste a couple of hours." Against his better judgment, Ryan agreed. But neither of them was prepared for what they would find. The forgotten platform. At 11:45 p.m., Ella and Ryan stood on the dimly lit platform of Metro Line 3. The station was nearly deserted, the hum of distant trains and the flicker of old fluorescent lights creating an eerie atmosphere. "The blog said to wait here," Ella said, glancing at her phone. Ryan leaned against a pillar, watching as the last regular train sped through the station without stopping. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "Do you even know what we're looking for?" he asked. "Ella Sanrio. A train that doesn't exist. Just keep an eye out." As the clock struck midnight, the air grew colder. The flickering lights dimmed further, casting long shadows on the tiled walls. Then, from the depths of the tunnel, came a low rumble. "Do you hear that?" Ella susurró, acercándose más al borde de la plataforma. Ryan nodded. It wasn't the usual sound of a train. It was deeper, slower, like a heavy weight being dragged through the darkness. Moments later, a train emerged from the tunnel. The silent train arrives. The train was unlike any they had seen before. Its cars were old, the metal tarnished and covered in streaks of grime. The windows were dark, the interiors dimly lit by flickering yellow lights. No passengers sat inside, and the usual screech of brakes was replaced by an eerie silence as it glided to a stop. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Ella stepped closer, peering inside. "It's empty," she said, her voice hushed. Ryan grabbed her arm. "Maybe we shouldn't." But Ella was already stepping into the car. "Come on," she said, pulling him along. Reluctantly, Ryan followed, the doors closing behind them with a metallic clang. The passengers in the dark inside, the train was even stranger. The seats were upholstered in faded red fabric, torn in places, and the overhead lights buzzed faintly. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. "This is creepy," Ryan muttered, glancing around. Ella took out her phone to snap a photo, but the screen remained black. She frowned, trying again, but the camera wouldn't work. "No signal," she said, holding up her phone. The train began to move, gliding silently through the tunnels. The windows were pitch black, offering no view of the outside. After a few minutes, Ryan noticed something odd. The train wasn't stopping. "We've passed at least 3 stations," he said. "Why aren't we stopping?" Ella se encogió de hombros. "Maybe it skips the regular stops." Ryan didn't respond. He was staring at the far end of the car where a shadowy figure sat, slumped in one of the seats. "Hey," he whispered, nudging Ella. "I thought you said it was empty." She followed his gaze and froze. The figure was motionless, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "When did they get on?" Ella asked. "I don't know," Ryan replied, his voice trembling. "They weren't there before." The unseen conductor. As the train continued, more figures began to appear, sitting in the seats, standing in the aisles, their faces hidden in shadow. None of them moved, but their presence filled the car with a suffocating tension. "We need to get off," Ryan said, standing abruptly. Ella nodded, but when they approached the doors, they found them sealed shut. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, pulling at the handles. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted and low. "Passengers, please remain seated." They turned toward the source of the voice, but no one was there. The figures in the seats seemed to shift slightly, their heads tilting ever so slightly toward Ella and Ryan. The train that never stops. The train began to slow, and for a moment they thought it was finally stopping. But as they peered out the windows, they realized the platform outside wasn't like any they'd seen before. It was old, ancient even. The walls were made of crumbling stone, covered in moss, and strange symbols etched into the surface. Torches flickered along the edges, casting eerie shadows that danced across the dark expanse. The train doors opened with a hiss. "Let's get out," Ella whispered. Ryan shook his head. "Number. We don't know where this is. It doesn't matter. I'm not staying on this thing." Ella stepped onto the platform and Ryan reluctantly followed. As soon as they were off the train, the doors slammed shut behind them, and the train sped off into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. The endless platform. The platform stretched into the shadows, disappearing into an impenetrable black void. "What is this place?" Ella asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. Ryan shined his flashlight down the length of the platform, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The only response was the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer.